This is not background noise. This is a divine interruption. I came to tell somebody in this room, or watching this moment, you have been holding onto something God never asked you to carry. And the weight of what you refuse to release is the very reason your miracle is still stuck in heaven's waiting room. Because there is a spiritual principle you cannot ignore. What you grip too tightly, God cannot replace. Listen to me like your future depends on it, because it does. You've been praying for a breakthrough, but still clutching the broken pieces. You've been asking God for new doors, but refusing to close old ones. And heaven is responding with silence, not because God is absent, but because you are still attached. But I hear the Spirit of God saying, when you release it, I release the solution. Not when you understand it. Not when you fix it. Not when you control it, but when you surrender it. Some of you are one release away from your next level, one surrender away from peace, one letting go away from clarity you've been begging for, and I came to declare. You are not losing it. You are letting it go so God can finally move in it. Release is not loss. It is access to divine replacement. That is a truth most people struggle to understand, because we've been trained by pain to believe that letting go means losing something valuable. But in the kingdom of God, release is never subtraction. It is preparation for replacement. What you think you are losing, God is often repositioning. What you call an ending, heaven calls an exchange. And what feels like emptiness is often the very space God needs to introduce something greater than what you were holding onto. There are moments in life where you are holding on so tightly to a relationship, a memory, a disappointment, or even a dream that has already expired. And you don't realize that your grip is the very thing blocking your next season. You are praying for elevation, but your hands are still full of what belongs to your past. And God, in His wisdom, will not pour new oil into a vessel that is already occupied by old residue. Not because He is unwilling, but because He is orderly. He does not add what cannot fit. He replaces what you release. Many people think God is delaying them, but in reality, He is waiting for them to participate in their own breakthrough. Release is participation. It is the moment you agree with heaven that what was once necessary is no longer required. It is the moment you stop negotiating with what has already expired. And this is where maturity begins, not when you get everything you want, but when you finally have the courage to walk away from what you once needed. There is a deep spiritual mystery in letting go. You don't just lose pain, you lose the authority it had over you. Because as long as you hold on to something, it continues to have a voice in your life. It continues to shape your decisions, your emotions, your expectations. But when you release it, you silence its influence. You don't just walk away from it, it walks away from your identity. And in that space, God begins to rebuild you without interference. Some of the things you are holding on to are not even blessings anymore. They are burdens disguised as comfort. Familiar pain can feel safer than unfamiliar peace. That is why release feels like grief, even when it is actually healing. You are not just letting go of what hurt you, you are letting go of what you got used to. And that is where the struggle lies, not in the value of what you're holding, but in the emotional attachment to it. But hear this clearly. God cannot introduce the next version of your life while you are still clinging to the previous version of your story. He is not trying to punish you by asking you to release it. He is trying to position you for replacement, because heaven does not operate in vacuum, it operates in exchange. Something must be released for something greater to be received. Think about it. Every major transition in life requires release. A seed must release its shell before it becomes a tree. A caterpillar must release its form before it becomes a butterfly. Even your breath requires release to bring in new life. Nothing grows without letting go. And yet, emotionally, we resist the very principle that sustains growth. You cannot step into a new season while still emotionally occupied with an old one. That is why some prayers feel unanswered, not because God is ignoring you, but because you are still mentally and emotionally occupied with what He already told you to release. Heaven is not confused. Heaven is waiting for alignment. And alignment begins with surrender. Release is not passive, it is powerful. It is not weakness, it is warfare. Because every time you release what is draining you, you are declaring that it no longer has authority over your future. You are breaking agreement with limitation. You are stepping out of emotional bondage. And in that moment, something shifts in the unseen realm. And here is the promise hidden in the principle. The moment you release what you were never meant to carry forever, God begins to release what you were always meant to receive. Not delayed, not postponed, not uncertain, but perfectly timed. Because divine replacement is never random. It is always intentional, always precise, always greater. So what feels like loss is actually preparation. What feels like emptiness is actually positioning. And what feels like letting go is actually stepping into the hands of a God who never removes without replacing, never empties without filling, and never ends without beginning something greater. Holding on delays healing. That is a truth that sounds simple in words, but it cuts deep when you begin to live it. Because most people don't realize they are not stuck because God is slow, but because they are still attached to what God is trying to heal them from. There is a hidden contradiction in the human heart. We pray for healing while still protecting the very thing that wounded us. We ask God to remove pain, but we keep revisiting it in our thoughts, rehearsing it in our emotions, and holding it in our identity. And in that condition, healing becomes difficult, not because God is unwilling, but because we are still holding what healing requires us to release. Healing is not just something God does to you. It is something you participate in by letting go. And holding on interrupts that process. It is like trying to close a wound while still keeping your hand on what caused it. Every time you revisit the offense, the betrayal, the failure, or the loss, you reopen what heaven is trying to seal. You delay the very thing you are praying for. And this is where many people live, caught in cycles of prayer without progress, worship without wholeness, faith without freedom. The human mind has a strange loyalty to pain. Even when pain is destructive, it can become familiar. And familiarity creates resistance to healing. Because healing requires stepping into the unknown. And the unknown feels unsafe when you are still emotionally tied to the past. So instead of releasing, people rehearse. They replay conversations that hurt them. They imagine outcomes that never happened. They hold internal arguments with people who have already moved on. And in doing so, they stay emotionally trapped in a moment God already moved beyond. But here is the spiritual principle. God cannot fully heal what you refuse to loosen your grip on. Not because His power is limited, but because your participation matters. Healing requires space, and holding on fills that space with emotional noise, unresolved pain, and spiritual clutter. You cannot pour peace into a heart still crowded with resentment. You cannot receive restoration while still entertaining the memory of what broke you. There are people praying for closure, but refusing to release access to the very thing that needs to close. Closure is not something someone else gives you. It is something you create by letting go. And until you do, you remain in a cycle where the past continues to speak louder than your future. It shapes your expectations, your trust, your relationships, even your ability to believe again. And without realizing it, you begin to build your present life around a past wound. Holding on also distorts your perception of God. It makes you believe He is late, when in reality he is waiting on your release. It makes you think he is silent, when he is actually responding to your resistance. Because heaven does not just respond to prayers, it responds to alignment. And alignment means your actions, your emotions, and your faith agree with what God is trying to do. If God is trying to heal you but you are still holding onto what broke you, there is misalignment. And misalignment delays manifestation. The delay is not punishment. It is participation. God is not withholding healing, He is waiting for cooperation. And cooperation looks like release. It looks like choosing not to revisit what God has already declared finished. It looks like refusing to give energy to what drains you. It looks like deciding that your future deserves more attention than your past. There is also a deeper truth here. Holding on doesn't preserve the past, it preserves the pain. People often believe they are protecting memories, relationships, or experiences. But what they are actually protecting is the wound attached to them. And wounds left unhealed become filters through which everything else is seen. You begin to interpret new people through old experiences. You begin to expect new outcomes based on old disappointments. And without realizing it, you live guarded, restricted, and emotionally unavailable. But healing requires openness. It requires trust. It requires surrender. And surrender is impossible while you are still gripping the very thing God is asking you to release. Because your grip communicates to heaven that you are still depending on what hurt you, instead of depending on what can heal you. There comes a moment where God will consistently invite you into healing through release. Not because He is trying to take something from you, but because He is trying to free you from something that is still holding you hostage internally. And the longer you hold on, the longer you postpone the peace that is already available. Healing is not far away. It is not delayed in heaven. It is interrupted on earth by attachment. And the moment you loosen your grip, something begins to shift. Not instantly always in circumstance, but immediately in your spirit. Because release creates space, and space invites healing. And what could not flow while you were holding on suddenly begins to move when you finally let go. You cannot receive new direction with old attachments. That is one of the most difficult truths for people to accept, because it challenges the way we naturally hold on to familiarity while still expecting transformation. We often want God to lead us forward, but we insist on dragging pieces of our past into the future. And in doing so, we create internal conflict, because direction from God requires openness. But attachment to the past creates resistance. You cannot move clearly into what God is saying next while still emotionally, mentally, or spiritually tied to what He has already finished with. Direction from God is not just information, it is transformation in motion. It requires sensitivity, clarity, and obedience, but attachments cloud all three. When you are attached to something God is asking you to release, your discernment becomes divided. You begin to hear God, but also hear your fear. You begin to sense your next step, but also feel the pull of your comfort zone. And suddenly, obedience becomes complicated not because God is unclear, but because your attachments are loud. Attachments are powerful because they are emotional anchors. They don't just live in memory, they live in identity. What you are attached to often becomes part of how you define yourself. A relationship, a season, a role, a failure, or even a success can become something you subconsciously use to describe who you are. And when God begins to shift you, He is not just asking you to move locations or situations. He is asking you to release identities that no longer match your assignment. This is where many people struggle. They are asking God for direction, but they are still emotionally committed to paths He has already redirected them from. They want clarity, but they are still connected to confusion they once survived. And the problem is not that God is silent. It is that attachments are loud enough to distort what he is saying. It is like trying to hear a whisper while holding onto noise. The whisper is still there, but your grip on the past creates interference. God's direction often requires separation before elevation. Because elevation demands space, you cannot ascend while still carrying what belongs to a lower level of your life. And attachments tend to anchor you to those lower levels. They convince you that staying connected equals safety, even when God is calling you into unfamiliar territory. But divine direction rarely feels familiar at first. It often feels like loss before it feels like purpose. It feels like disconnect before it feels like destiny. There is also a subtle danger in attachments. They create emotional bias in decision-making. When you are attached, you no longer evaluate situations clearly. You begin to choose based on comfort rather than calling. You begin to interpret signs based on what you want instead of what is actually true. And slowly, you drift from divine direction while still believing you are following it. This is how people end up in cycles of frustration, because they are moving but not aligned. God's direction requires surrender, not negotiation. But attachments always negotiate. They say, God, I will follow you. But let me keep this one thing. And that one thing becomes the barrier between clarity and confusion. Because partial surrender leads to partial understanding. And partial understanding leads to misaligned steps. The truth is, God is not just trying to lead you somewhere new. He is trying to lead you as someone new. And you cannot become new while still holding on to what shaped the old version of you. Attachments keep you emotionally tied to outdated versions of yourself. They keep you responding from past pain instead of present purpose. And when God speaks direction, he speaks to the future version of you, not the one still tied to yesterday. This is why obedience often feels like release before it feels like reward. Because to follow God's direction, you must first loosen your grip on what is familiar. And familiarity is one of the strongest forces against faith. It convinces you that what you can see, control, or predict is safer than what God is leading you into. But divine direction is not built on predictability. It is built on trust. There is a tension that comes with being led by God while still attached to something he is moving you away from. It creates hesitation. It creates double-mindedness. And eventually it creates delay, not because God has stopped speaking, but because your attachment is slowing your response. And delayed response often feels like delayed destiny. But here is the deeper truth. God will not compete with your attachments. He will not shout louder than what you refuse to release. Instead, he invites you into clarity through surrender. Because clarity is not just about hearing God. It is about being free enough to follow him without resistance. When you finally loosen your attachment, something shifts internally. Not just your circumstances, but your perception. You begin to see differently, because you are no longer filtering God's direction through emotional dependency. You begin to move with less confusion, because your heart is no longer divided. And in that space, direction becomes clearer, not because God changed what he was saying, but because you removed what was blocking your understanding. And that is the hidden key. New direction always requires old attachments to lose their authority over you. Control is often disguised fear. That is a truth many people don't recognize because control rarely announces itself as fear. It presents itself as responsibility, wisdom, caution, or even strength. But underneath much of what we call being in control is a deeper emotional reality. We are afraid of what might happen if we let go. We are afraid of uncertainty, afraid of disappointment, afraid of being hurt again, and afraid of outcomes we cannot predict. So instead of trusting, we tighten our grip. Instead of surrendering, we strategize. Instead of resting, we overthink. And all the while, what looks like control on the outside is actually fear operating in disguise on the inside. When people try to control everything, they are often responding to internal instability. Something within them believes that if they do not manage every detail, everything will fall apart. So they monitor outcomes, people, conversations, timing, and possibilities. They try to anticipate every scenario so nothing surprises them. But life was never designed to be fully controlled by human effort. And the more you try to control what is beyond you, the more anxious you become. Because control creates an illusion of safety, but it does not produce real peace. Fear convinces you that surrender is dangerous. It whispers that if you let go, things will collapse, people will leave. Opportunities will disappear, or life will become chaotic. So you hold on tighter. You micromanage relationships, you overthink decisions. You rehearse conversations in your mind before they even happen. And you try to predict outcomes that have not yet arrived. But in doing so, you slowly exhaust your emotional strength. Because control demands constant mental effort, constant vigilance, and constant emotional engagement. What many people don't realize is that control is not power, it is pressure. It gives the appearance of strength, but internally it drains you. Because you are carrying responsibility for things you were never meant to carry. And the irony is that the more you try to control life, the less peace you experience in it. You may get temporary stability, but you lose inner rest. You may avoid certain risks, but you also avoid growth. And over time, control becomes a prison that feels safe, but slowly limits your ability to experience freedom. Fear is at the center of this dynamic, because fear always focuses on what could go wrong. It does not operate in trust, it operates in worst-case scenarios. And when fear leads, it pushes you into excessive management of everything around you. You begin to believe that if you are not constantly intervening, things will fail. But life is not sustained by human control alone. There are forces beyond your understanding, timing beyond your planning, and outcomes beyond your calculation. And trying to control what belongs to God or to natural flow creates internal tension that never fully resolves. Control also affects relationships deeply. When fear is driving control, people begin to hold others too tightly. They try to manage how others respond, how others behave, and even how others feel. But love cannot thrive in control. Relationships begin to suffocate under pressure when one or both people are operating from fear rather than trust. Because trust allows space, but control demands confinement. And what is confined eventually resists. There is also a hidden exhaustion that comes with control. It is not always visible externally, but internally it is heavy. Because when you are trying to manage everything, you are never fully at rest. Even in moments of calm, your mind is scanning for what could go wrong next. Even in moments of progress, you are anticipating potential failure. And this constant mental activity creates fatigue that is not physical but emotional and spiritual. But beneath this need for control is often an unspoken fear of vulnerability. Because surrender requires vulnerability. It requires admitting that you are not in charge of everything, that you do not have all answers, and that some outcomes are beyond your ability to secure. And for many people, that feels unsafe, so control becomes a shield. It protects them from the discomfort of uncertainty, but it also blocks them from experiencing deeper peace. The paradox is that what fear tries to protect you from often increases when you try to control it. The more you try to control people, the more strained relationships become. The more you try to control outcomes, the more anxious you feel. The more you try to control timing, the more frustrated you become. Because life resists excessive control. It flows best in alignment, not domination. True peace does not come from control, it comes from trust. But trust requires letting go of the illusion that you can manage everything. It requires accepting that not everything depends on your effort. It requires acknowledging that some things must unfold without your interference. And that realization is uncomfortable for fear, but liberating for the soul. When you begin to recognize control as disguised fear, something shifts internally. You start to see where you have been holding too tightly. You start to notice the areas where anxiety has been driving your decisions. And slowly, you begin to loosen your grip, not because everything is certain, but because you realize that control was never giving you the peace it promised. And in that space of loosening, something powerful happens. You begin to breathe differently. Not because life becomes predictable, but because you stop trying to dominate what was never meant to be controlled. Letting go is an act of faith, not failure. That is one of the most misunderstood truths in the human experience. Because from a natural perspective, letting go often feels like defeat. It feels like loss, like surrender in the wrong sense, like giving up on something that still has emotional weight. But spiritually, letting go is never the language of failure. It is the language of trust. It is the moment you stop leaning on your own understanding and begin to trust a higher order that you cannot fully see, but are invited to believe in. Most people resist letting go because they interpret it through the lens of what they are losing, instead of what they are stepping into. They see the empty space left behind and assume emptiness means absence of good. But in reality, emptiness is often preparation. It is space being created for something that has not yet arrived. And faith is required to stay in that space, without trying to immediately fill it with what is familiar. Even if what is familiar is no longer healthy, aligned, or sustainable. Letting go challenges the deepest human instinct, the desire to hold on to what is known. Even when what is known is painful, uncertain, or limiting, it still feels safer than the unknown. So people cling to relationships that have already expired, habits that no longer serve them, mindsets that keep them stuck, and situations that drain them. Not because those things are still beneficial, but because they are familiar. And familiarity often disguises itself as security. But faith always calls you beyond familiarity into trust. When you let go, you are not abandoning hope, you are redirecting it. You are no longer placing hope in what you can see, touch, or control. Instead, you are placing hope in something greater than your immediate circumstances. And that requires courage, because faith does not always come with immediate evidence. It requires you to trust before you see, to release before you understand, to move before everything feels settled. This is why letting go is deeply spiritual. It is not just a mental decision, it is an inner alignment. It is the moment your spirit says, I may not understand this fully, but I trust that I am being led, and that kind of trust cannot exist alongside tight control. It requires surrender, and surrender is not passive, it is active faith. It is choosing to release even when your emotions are still attached, even when your mind is still questioning, and even when your past is still pulling you back. Many people think faith means holding on tightly to what they want until it manifests. But sometimes faith looks like releasing what you want because you trust that what is ahead is greater than what is in your hand. That is a deeper level of belief. It is not rooted in possession, but in confidence that you are not losing something valuable. You are making room for something better aligned with your purpose and growth. Letting go also confronts pride in subtle ways. Because holding on often gives the illusion that you are responsible for keeping things together. It makes you feel like if you release your grip, everything will collapse. but that belief places you in a position of unnecessary burden. It makes you believe you are the sustaining force of everything in your life. And that pressure is heavy. Faith, however, shifts that responsibility. It says, I am not the source. I am guided by the source, and in that realization, letting go becomes less about losing control and more about returning control to where it truly belongs. There is also emotional resistance to letting go, because it often requires facing grief. Even when something is not good for you anymore, releasing it can still hurt. Because attachment creates emotional bonds that do not break instantly. So letting go may come with sadness, memories, and internal conflict. But faith does not deny those emotions, it moves through them. It does not pretend there is no pain. It trusts that pain is part of transition, not the end of the story. Over time, what feels like loss begins to reveal itself as redirection. What once felt like confusion begins to show hidden protection. And what seemed like failure starts to look like divine rearrangement. But you only see that perspective after you have let go. While holding on, everything feels like uncertainty. But after releasing, clarity slowly begins to emerge. Letting go is also a declaration. It is a silent statement that says, I trust what I cannot yet see more than what I can currently hold, and that is not easy. It requires inner strength that does not come from circumstance, but from conviction. It requires believing that your life is not random, that your steps are not wasted, and that even endings can serve a greater purpose. And as you continue to let go of what no longer serves your growth, something begins to shift within you. You become lighter internally. Not because life becomes instantly perfect, but because you are no longer carrying what was never meant to stay. And in that lightness, faith matures, not as a concept you understand, but as a posture you live. Some answers only come after surrender. That is a truth that challenges the way most people approach life. Because we are conditioned to believe that answers come through effort, analysis, persistence, and control. We think if we think harder, pray longer, try more strategies, or push further, we will eventually unlock clarity. But there are moments in life where clarity is not withheld by lack of effort. It is delayed by lack of surrender. Because some answers are not revealed to the mind that is striving, but to the heart that has finally released. Striving keeps you in motion, but surrender brings you into alignment. And alignment is where revelation begins. Many people are searching for answers while still holding tightly to their own interpretations, their own expectations, and their own preferred outcomes. But God does not just respond to pursuit, He responds to posture. And surrender is a posture that says, I am open to truth beyond my assumptions. When you are holding on tightly to your own way of understanding, you unintentionally limit what you can receive. Because your grip on control becomes a filter through which everything is processed. You interpret circumstances based on what you want them to mean, not what they are actually revealing. You pray for clarity, but your expectations are louder than your listening. And in that state, answers remain hidden, not because they are absent, but because you are still attached to a narrative that blocks perception. Surrender changes that dynamic. It does not mean you stop seeking. It means you stop resisting what you might discover. It is the moment you stop demanding that truth fit your preference. And that shift opens a deeper level of understanding. Because truth often arrives in forms that challenge what you assumed was right. And if you are not surrendered, you will reject the answer simply because it does not match your expectation. There is also a timing element to this principle. Some answers are not just about information, they are about transformation. And transformation requires readiness. If an answer arrives before you are surrendered, you may misinterpret it, misuse it, or resist it entirely. So what feels like delay is often divine timing, ensuring that when the answer comes, you are in the right posture to receive it fully. Surrender is what prepares the heart to receive truth without distortion. It removes the noise of self-will, self-protection, and self-direction. And when that noise quiets down, something powerful happens. Clarity begins to emerge naturally, not because circumstances suddenly change, but because perception changes. You begin to see what was already there, but hidden behind internal resistance. Many people miss answers because they are still arguing internally with what they do not want to accept. They are asking questions, but simultaneously rejecting possible responses. They want direction, but only if it leads where they already decided to go. And that internal contradiction creates confusion, because clarity cannot flow where resistance remains active. Surrender resolves that contradiction. It is not passive, it is deeply active. It is a conscious decision to stop forcing outcomes and start allowing truth to reveal itself. And in that space of allowance, answers begin to surface with a different kind of clarity. Not rushed, not forced, not distorted, but steady, grounded, and undeniable. There is also a deeper emotional layer to surrender. Because sometimes, the answers we are seeking are tied to things we are not yet ready to release. We want clarity about a situation, but we are still emotionally invested in a particular outcome. And that emotional investment clouds our ability to accept truth that does not align with desire. So we keep searching, but we are not truly open. We are seeking confirmation, not revelation. Surrender breaks that cycle. It shifts you from needing a specific outcome to needing truth itself. And that shift is powerful because truth is not always comfortable, but it is always liberating. It may not validate your expectations, but it will free you from confusion. And freedom is often more valuable than certainty rooted in illusion. There are also moments where surrender is the only path that leads beyond mental limitation. Because the mind can only process based on what it already knows. But life often requires answers that exist beyond current understanding. And to access those answers, you must step beyond mental control into spiritual openness. Surrender becomes that doorway, and when you finally surrender, something subtle but profound begins to happen. You start noticing patterns you couldn't see before. You start understanding timing differently. You start recognizing meaning in places that once felt random. Not because reality changed, but because you changed your relationship with reality. You are no longer forcing interpretation. You are receiving insight. This is why some answers seem to arrive suddenly, after long periods of confusion. It is not that they suddenly appeared. It is that surrender removed the internal barriers that were blocking perception. The answer was always there, but now you are finally able to see it without distortion. Surrender does not weaken you, it refines your awareness. It does not reduce your understanding, it deepens it. And most importantly, it aligns you with truth in a way that striving alone cannot achieve. Because some doors do not open by pushing harder. They open when you stop resisting the handle and allow it to turn naturally. And in that moment, when surrender meets timing, answers stop being something you chase and become something you recognize. What you refuse to release becomes what controls you. That is a reality most people don't immediately recognize, because control is not always obvious in its operation. It does not always appear as domination from the outside. It often appears as inner preoccupation, emotional dependency, and repeated mental return to something you cannot seem to let go of. And the longer you hold on to it, the more influence it begins to have over your thoughts, your emotions, your decisions, and even your sense of identity. There is a hidden exchange that happens in the human soul when something is not released. Whatever you hold tightly, you also give authority to. It begins to occupy space in your mind without permission. It shows up in your thoughts when you are trying to move forward. It influences your mood without warning. It shapes how you respond to new opportunities, new relationships, and even new possibilities. And slowly, what you thought you were simply remembering becomes something that is actively shaping your present. Refusal to release is often rooted in attachment, and attachment creates ongoing connection. Even if the situation is no longer physically present, emotionally it remains active. You may have walked away from it externally, but internally it still has access. And anything that still has access to your inner world still has influence. That is how control is formed, not through force from outside, but through permission from within. What you refuse to release continues to speak in your inner dialogue. It becomes a reference point for comparison. You measure new experiences against it. You interpret new people through its memory. You anticipate future outcomes based on its history. And without realizing it, your present becomes filtered through something that belongs to your past. And anything filtered through the past cannot be fully experienced in its present truth. This is how control develops subtly. It does not announce itself. It integrates itself into your thinking. It becomes part of your emotional reflex. So when similar situations arise, you don't respond from clarity, you respond from memory. And memory, when unhealed or unreleased, becomes a controlling influence. It dictates reactions before awareness can intervene. There is also an emotional cost to holding on, because what you refuse to release does not remain neutral. It demands energy. It requires attention. It pulls emotional resources even when you are trying to focus elsewhere. That is why people often feel drained without understanding why. It is not always the present situation that is exhausting them. It is the unresolved past that continues to demand emotional engagement. And the more energy you give to what should have been released, the less energy remains for what is ahead. This creates imbalance. You are physically present in new seasons, but emotionally still tied to old ones. And that divided state weakens clarity, because where attention goes, influence grows. And anything that consistently receives your attention begins to gain authority in your internal world. What you refuse to release also becomes a filter for fear. It teaches your mind to expect repetition of past pain. So even when new opportunities appear, hesitation arises. Not because the opportunity is harmful, but because the memory of what once hurt you is still active. And that memory begins to project itself onto situations that are not connected to it. So you respond cautiously, defensively, or even avoidantly, not because of what is happening now, but because of what happened before. In this way, unreleased experiences become silent governors of present behavior. They shape boundaries that are no longer necessary. They create limitations that no longer serve you. And over time, they convince you that restriction is wisdom, when in reality it is often unresolved attachment. There is also a deeper psychological effect. What you refuse to release becomes part of your self-narrative. It influences how you see yourself. You may begin to identify as someone who was hurt, someone who was betrayed, someone who failed, or someone who lost. And when those identities remain unchallenged, they begin to define your expectations for the future. You begin to assume that what happened before is what will always happen again. And that assumption quietly limits your openness to new outcomes. But the most important truth is this: anything that still has emotional access to you still has directional influence over you. It can subtly redirect your focus. It can delay your progress by keeping your attention divided. It can reduce your confidence by replaying old outcomes. and it can shape your decisions without you even realizing it is still active in your inner world. Release is what breaks that influence, because release does not erase memory, it removes authority. It allows the past to remain as information, not as control. And when something no longer controls you, it loses its power to define your present reactions and future expectations. Until that release happens, what you are holding continues to operate in the background of your life. It may not always be visible, but it is active. It is influencing how you think, how you feel, and how you move. And that is why letting go is not just about emotional relief. It is about reclaiming internal authority from what no longer deserves to lead you.